Good afternoon. Welcome to Structured Conversation. I'm In-Kyung Park from George Mason University and currently serve as the chair of the Professional Development and Learning Committee at SAAL. I'll serve as your moderator today. On behalf of SAAL Professional Learning and Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra thank you to today's guest speakers. I encourage you to participate in today's discussion by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through chatting. We are committed to involve, feature, and represent diverse perspectives and identities in our professional development offerings and want to meet your professional development needs. Today, we will talk about the SAAL members' needs assessment results and considerations of using the modified O'Neill group technique. Today's panelists are Dr. Vince Nix, Dr. Ashley Farmer-Hansen, Dr. Cindy Fleming. Dr. Vince Nix is a core research methodologist and an assistant professor in the EDD program in West Texas A&M University. Vince has served as an assistant professor for 7 different universities around the globe. Dr. Ashley Farmer-Hansen has 15 years of student affairs experience and is currently the Associate Dean of Student Affairs at Rocky Vista University and Assistant Professor of Medical Humanities. Dr. Cindy Fleming has 13 years of higher education experience and is currently the Associate Dean of Students at Carleton College. She serves as a class dean and leads the Division of Student Lives Assessment at Forbes. Now, please welcome our guest speakers.
Excellent. Thank you everyone so much for being here today. As good student affairs assessment professionals, we have some learning outcomes for you here listed. So some of our goals here today are for you to understand the NGT and the mNGT, to recognize different fields and uses for the qualitative methodology, and really hopefully to contrast the method to focus groups as an assessment tactic, and consider varying groups or approaches that would benefit from an mNGT, and really examine the outcomes from our recent mNGT and needs assessment and how that impacts SAAL moving forward.
To unmute before I talk, right? Okay, so I'm going to go over 3 basic areas of nominal group techniques, or NGTs, before we start talking about our mNGT specifically. And I'll cover some history, how the methodology came to be and how people have used it. Cindy, I think, will go over some basics from the CDC, and then I will go over how it has been variously adapted in research. Next, please. So one of the main things that I found out when I started looking for a different way to get qualitative data was that this had been used for many years for change agents and in change management procedures. And so we've got the final slide today has a QR code, so you can scan later with a list of resources, and all the references for the things I'm talking about today are on that. So just know that you have access to that at the end of the talk here. But this first, Gresham talked about this. He did a dissertation in 1988 and then later published an article about this. And so he talked about basically what it is. It's a small group process. Every member is allowed full participation without any hindrance from the other group members. And it's so one of the main claims of the NGT is that it counteracts and minimizes some of the dysfunctional features of working groups. And that's important because sometimes we see focus groups where we see 1 or 2 people dominate the discussion. And so this takes that potential away. And there are some basic advantages here. So it increases the creativity and participation of every member. It really is geared toward problem solving and fact-finding tasks. It helps us develop or expand perception of critical issues within sticky or problem areas. It identifies priorities of selected issues within the problems, and it considers the viewpoints of differently oriented groups. And then it obtains the input of many individuals, as I said before, without the dysfunction of unbalanced participation, which often occurs in large groups. And so the basic steps here are that we provide an outline of the NGT activity, whoever the facilitator would be. And if we do it live, that takes about 10 to 20 minutes to give a handout so people understand what is it that we're looking at. And then when you have we call a panel, I classify this into the panel methodology, focus groups, Delphi studies, NGTs. And so generally you have 5 to 7 people. You don't want any more than 10 people. It gets a little bit unwieldy if you have more than 10 per panel. And then we describe the issue or the decision to the participants. We always have a facilitator, and you also might want to have a recorder. Somebody like today, we have a technical person and a moderator. It's always good to have a facilitator serving as the moderator and then a recorder to make sure that nothing is lost. Of course, in our approach, the mNGT we did it online, and so Zoom itself served as our recorder. So that was very handy. We had a transcript when we were done. But sometimes we do these face-to-face. And so we always begin with a quiet time for each participant, and then everybody gives their ideas of ranking the issues that created these problems or something like that. And then eventually we put everything together and we clarify if there's anything that's written that wasn't quite clear. And then we evaluate all the items that everybody presented and we rank those. So that's the basic thing. And what, again, I just want to re-emphasize the main benefits are equal status of members, right? And it's task oriented. We don't lose focus from what we're doing. And the outcome is we have written products. And then it's okay. It's easier for group members to raise difficult problems because there's no shame, there's no blame, there's no judgment. It's all anonymous when those things are presented in the first step. Okay, I think next slide, and that'll be maybe Cindy.
Yes, thank you, Vince. And Vince touched a little bit into the 4-step process, right? What entails the NGT. And so, as Vince had mentioned, the first step is to generate ideas. And that is the moderator presents the question to the participants that I like to call instead of panel, right? And then they go ahead and write down silently the responses to it or ideas. And then from there on, we move on to the second step, which is to record the ideas. And this, once these are recorded, you can do it in a way that you can go do it round robin feedback style. And so you keep going around until you gather all the feedback from the participants and they are listed on the flip chart. And as Vince said, there's no debate, no discussion at this point. It's more just about sharing ideas and putting them down somewhere for all to see. Step 3 would be to discuss the ideas. And in this situation, the moderator plays a role where they will ask questions to help determine the clarity of the idea or the statement, and then also to identify the importance. And then at this point, the creator of the idea of the suggestion can also remain silent, which helps with the person being anonymous. And it also, let me see, then we move on to ranking ideas that we have on the flip chart. And this may occur privately or publicly, depending on the group dynamics and what your goal is. But the moderator may invoke a criteria or not, depending on what they're thinking. They may also rank each participant's idea using the flip chart. So either using like a tally method or some kind of like a colorful dot to identify the ranking for each one. And then we'll move on to the next slide.
So the consensus building idea of using a modified or NGT comes from Mullen, Fleming, and Macmillan, and it's not Cindy Fleming, just to make sure, but it is someone named Fleming. So, and one of the things that they do in their research is to distinguish nominal group technique from focus groups and from a Delphi technique. And many of you may already be familiar with focus groups. I'm not sure how familiar you might be with Delphi techniques, but Delphi's generally can be done by email. And you just get an expert panel or participants, group of participants to rank ideas and then get them back. And then the facilitator does all that behind the scenes on email. As we know, a focus group's got everybody in one area and we talk back and forth. It's a sort of it's a conversation, really. But in the NGT, the benefit over the Delphi is that we still have face-to-face discussions. And we can, and so when we did ours, as I said, we had Zoom sessions. So people could choose not to have their cameras on if they wanted, but I guess given the nature of student affairs professionals as a group, right? Everybody turned their cameras on and eventually it became sort of the same dynamics as a focus group, but we didn't have that first step where everybody had to put their ideas out in public. We just discussed the ideas. And so another advantage over what this group Mullen et al. Found was that you can actually prove, and they use the word prove, the benefits of the NGT over other consensus building processes because they counted, they've held several of these and counted the numbers of ideas generated. And so quantitatively, even though this is a qualitative approach, right? Quantitatively, NGT has been shown across studies to generate more ideas than either a focus group or a Delphi technique. And so that was a really good weighting to say, okay, this is more beneficial. And then what they did to rate those also, which we didn't do, but I think it's a good thing, is to what extent did you feel freely participative, right, in the meeting? How satisfied were you with the quantity of ideas? And we did give our participants a chance to go back and re-rank anonymously. So we were doing with that. And then the satisfaction of the ideas, we talked about that in our meetings. And what the basic finding was that NGT is superior to the always interacting groups. When you have that little private session to start the thing, and then you interact, it just came out with a lot better stuff. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so peer coaching, right. So this study comes from Bell, Meyer, and Maggio. Again, you'll have those references on the last slide. But they identified 17 best practices. And all of the participant experts recommended a framework for this peer observation process, including a pre-observation meeting and a post-observation debrief. And so they expressed the importance of confidentiality to begin with, and then behaviorally based feedback as NGTs are used for these kinds of development procedures. And so they showed that they wound up in their study with a practical guide to optimize teaching, coaching, and development effectiveness. And so it's really a good practical study if you want to look at that. What they said, though, there are some pitfalls and barriers because coaching initiatives from the perspective of different groups, academic leadership, peer coaches, and then people who are being observed themselves, had a little bit of different perspectives in these things. So they gave some recommendations to think about if you're using it for coaching or development kinds of purposes. Next slide, please. And so for best practices generation, we brought that from Wiggins et al. And so they said that they were using a modified NGT as we did. They said it successfully reduced the limitations common to the traditional nominal group technique by providing an in-depth understanding of perceptions and understanding priorities of marginalized groups. And so their conclusion was that NGT could be useful across other disciplines because it gathers such rich qualitative feedback that then can be transformed into a more quantitative form of analysis. But that they cautioned that the quantitative approach should be applied only after the rich discussion through a qualitative lens has already occurred. And so this edition may not limit the richness of the participants' thoughts, and instead it provides a voice for the participants who may be less comfortable engaging in more traditional qualitative verbal discussions like focus groups. And so right now, we don't have a lot of this being used across education, in my experience, especially in student affairs. But I think by showing that this mNGT is used across a variety of settings, we can show that it actually is a more efficient and effective way to prioritize factors in group settings. But also, one of the reasons we don't do qualitative assessment as much is because the time constraints. A modified mNGT, basically, you can spend 2 hours on that if you do the groundwork beforehand, as we did. And I think one of my colleagues will talk about that in just a bit. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is what I've been using it for about, I guess, 4 years now. When I first started chairing dissertations, I was interested in getting students to use this as a first stage. And so when you look at the reference sheet that we'll show you at the end, I've got 2 of the dissertations that I chaired. One of those, Dr. Tamayo in Texas, both of these were in Texas, he was looking at returning to normal after COVID in K-12, EC-12 settings. And he used COVID as a great breach event, as Garfinkel's ethnomethodological framework suggests that we need to interrupt things to ever find out what is normal. And what he found an interesting thing. So he used a modified mNGT, but he asked a panel of administrators, like top-level administrators across districts in the state of Texas, what they thought they needed to do to return to normal. And then he developed what they came up with into a quantitative questionnaire and sent it out to some teachers. And what he found was accountability was one of the main things that they disagreed about. Administrators were saying, maybe we should reduce accountability. But the teachers were saying, no, we need to increase accountability. So you see this richness that you can do with mixed methods and using this as a first stage can really also show you where the data diverges. And so I thought that was a very interesting study. And then the second one that I chaired was Dr. Cleveland. And so there's a thing in Texas called school choice, and it's a little bit different from charter schools. It's a little bit different from private schools in my background, the way I perceived it. But there are some of those similarities too. But she did the same thing, but she did teachers, I think, first in hers, and then administrators completed her questionnaire. And again, she found some divergence and some suggestions. But what her focus was what both panels' perceptions of parents were. Why would they take their children out of schools and put them in schools of choice? And what she found was it's a marketing thing. If public schools would put money into marketing, then parents would pay attention to that and keep their kids in public schools. So it was really interesting how you can distill down that. And then, of course, our current study that we've done also was geared this way too. So we held 3 separate groups, and my colleagues will go into what we did, but we're going to use the findings of this mNGT to develop a quantitative questionnaire that we will put out later in the fall, and I'll go over that in another slide. Okay, I think I'll turn it over to one of my colleagues now.
Yes, and now we get to talk a little bit of what we did, right, with the modified nominal group technique. And so here to the left, you see the original process, which, it involves a flip chart, possibly a box or a hat to gather the ideas that can also be placed on sticky notes. And from there on, you can, voting can be done manually or using multicolored dots that represent the ranking of the preference, as I mentioned before. And here to the right is step 1 for the process that we followed. And that involved using a Google form for participants to enter their ideas anonymously prior to coming together, and their identities were kept private throughout the process. So they provided their ideas and they were also able to rank them as well. Okay. And here, what we wanted to show you is that an actual, I guess, an example of what it looked like for us. So once we gathered the ideas anonymously, the group came together on Zoom, and moderators used separate Google Jamboard virtual sticky notes and placed an idea per sticky note. On this specific Jamboard, participants answered the question, what are the top 5 reasons you continue to be a member of SAAL? And then the moderator rearranged and ordered the sticky notes as the panels discussed and ranked them in real time. And then we placed them on the side with a rank number. Some of us got a little creative here. We changed the color of the sticky note as well, just to help differentiate the ones that we had already talked about. And overall, we held 3 separate Zoom meetings, about 2 hours each. And so here is actually another example of the sticky notes, just to see, how we were doing it. And on the top, we put the question that we were focusing on at that time. Okay. And then on this one, this is also another example of the Jamboard. But at the end, the moderators also offered a panel voting or ranking option for each participant in case they were not in agreement with the group's final rankings, which also helped us to gain consensus and to see if there was any disagreement during the process that was not mentioned.
I believe I have this slide here. So some of our reflections initially shared, I think this has been covered a little bit, but it's a new tool or another tool for your toolbox outside of surveys and focus groups. And it really allowed for a place for all voices. I think we've all probably been in those meetings where there's a couple people who dominate the conversation. This provided a safe space for individuals to provide their opinion, and they had the opportunity to share it if they wanted to, or as I think Vince had mentioned, they could stay anonymous. And it's a unique way for the group to reach consensus. Throughout the process, that was one of the things that I really enjoyed, was the conversation and the dialogue that happened that was centered around coming to a consensus. It was really powerful. And I think we were able to gain more knowledge about what the needs were of SAAL through that. And I think I've covered this, but it was an additional step for participants to voice their preference. So they could do that in multiple ways, multiple platforms, and it felt so inclusive. I think that I really left feeling like we created almost a small community of people who had maybe never met before over one topic, and that was SAAL and the future of it. So next year, we're going to talk about what our findings were. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So Cindy mentioned this a little bit earlier. So here are some of the guiding questions that we started with our mNGT. So what do assessment professionals expect from SAAL? What do they perceive they receive from their membership? What is SAAL doing that is useful from a professional perspective? And what can the organization do to more effectively meet the needs of its target population? Next slide.
Yes, and here we wanted to highlight some of the findings that we were able to gather that it also tied in, right? It tied into SAAL. And let me see. So we have the top 6 that we wanted to share with you all. And so the first one is that SAAL's commitment to equity centered assessment is primary reason that assessment professionals engage with the organization. Number two is about the resource repository, is that SAAL's resource repository is perhaps the most valuable service for members, but a more systematic and organized presentation would be appreciated. The third one, it involves the SAAL's listserv, and similarly, the SAAL listserv is quite useful, but needs moderation and additional organization to make it more user-friendly.
Excellent. And the fourth one here is structured conversations. So sessions just like these. People really enjoyed them for professional development, team building, but the feedback was shorter snippets may increase engagement. The fifth one, the assessment MOOC, hopefully you've been able to participate in those or in that course, is genuinely appreciated by the community and is a springboard and orientation resource for new professionals in the field or professionals who have not maybe engaged in student affairs assessment in their work before. And the sixth one, I saw an email come out about this today, is the blogs. They're used as a resource for practitioners and even more so than the SAAL journal.
So what are we going to do with this information? So that we are, and I am not on the professional development committee this year. I'm on the research and advancing knowledge group. So one of the things we're going to do, SAAL has generally in the past, not recently though, set out what we call the landscape survey of the profession. And that will come out in the fall. And that's always basically, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And what sort of resources do we have? And what sort of resources do we need? But we're also going to put out a quantitative survey questionnaire about basically relative agreement to see how many people agree with what we found qualitatively for this. And so that will happen in the fall. We met last week as the Advancing Knowledge Committee and decided, since the semester is in terms, whatever you use, is winding down, we want to not add that to a list of everybody trying to close out processes. And a lot of people may take the summers off. So in the fall, please, all SAAL membership, be ready for two very quick, down and dirty, quantitative questionnaires that will be sent out as a survey. One will be a landscape, and the next one will be a follow-up for relative agreement with what we have found through this qualitative process using an mNGT for needs assessment of SAAL membership. Thank you. And I think we are ready for. And if you want to advance to that last slide, so people, if they want to, could scan the QR code. That are all the references that we talked about from the academics part, right? Those are there on that document. But I think we'll open it up for questions.
Great, thank you. Now we have time for comments and questions from our participants. If you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, please feel free to type them into the chat at this time.
I'm just unmuting briefly. Vince, when I tried to access that QR code, it's telling me I need permission. So maybe the permissions need to be reset on the documents it's linking to.
All right, I do have a question. So in what setting is the mNGT used traditionally?
So I'm sorry, I was focusing on the
Permission,
sure the permissions
sorry.
were right. And if you can't still access it, let me know. I think I set the permissions. I'm sorry about that. So you ask about what now? I'm sorry.
Sure. In what setting is the mNGT used traditionally?
So traditionally it was used in agriculture. That's the first time that we saw it. And then it was used in what we call developing curriculum. The Ohio State University has a certification in DACUM, D-A-C-U-M, which is an acronym for developing a curriculum. And that's where the mNGT really caught hold, because they would have experts come in and say, okay, if we're going to develop a new course or a set of courses, a new major or something, how would we do this? And so they would come to consensus about what were the most important parts that go into that. And then so since I found it, I used it for strategic planning for many years. I've taught strategic planning, and I've been a strategic planning consultant for organizations. And I find that this is one of the best first steps for generating strengths, weaknesses, opportunities from a perspective of the employees, right? And so then you can go deeper into your strategic planning processes with whatever you choose to use, right? But this is always a good first step, and it gets qualitative data. That's the thing. And so I think it can be used across any setting, any industry. I never knew what it was when I was a dedicated student affairs practitioner. I only discovered it after moving into an administrative role, like C-level role over academics. And so traditionally, that's where it's been, sort of an academic side of the house thing. Good question.
We got a question in the chat. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation of the findings around current programmatic offering of SAAL. What did you learn about members' thoughts about the structure of SAAL or future offering?
I'll yield to my colleagues on that because I like their perspectives.
One of the things that I took away is that there are a lot of people who really care about SAAL as an organization and want to be involved, and they want to be better professionally. And I think in student affairs assessment, it can feel isolating sometimes because there may be one or two professionals on your campus. And so the community that is created through SAAL is something that's incredibly valuable to members and something that time and resources should be invested in. Cindy, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, yes. And I was going to say, it's something that it's very similar to what we're seeing if we work in higher ed, right? That we see our students wanting to engage more, especially after COVID. And I think that's something, I know Ashley brought it up, that they were surprised that the members of SAAL are not paid, right? We don't get paid. This is all volunteer work, but they also, with that, they wanted to see more engagement within the SAAL community. So either like mentors or connecting with other people about things that they have done or strategies, or just have like a sit down conversation virtually.
Yeah, and so I want to add just a little bit in there. Thank you both. It's sort of stemming off what Cindy said and what Ashley said. But one of the things I thought was quite interesting about the not being paid is that some people didn't realize SAAL was an organization because and what they said was because we don't have fees. They thought it was like an add-on for some other professional organization. So one of the things we will ask when we send out the questionnaire is how much, or would you be willing to pay to be a member of SAAL? Because a lot of people wanted to put on our own conference or our own sort of like a 2-day thing. And so that's not possible without money. That SAAL has always at its heart from the founding wanted to be a free thing. And that's like one of the core values. We never want to charge for our services. And so that's an interesting shift in mindsets. And we don't know if everybody would agree with that or if it was just our panel. So that's one of the things we'll want to explore later in the questionnaire. So I'm going to go ahead and start on that strategic planning question I saw pop up there, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going to look at it again.
Can you also read the question?
Yeah, so it says, I love that you mentioned strategic planning. I'd been involved in our strategic planning process last semester when the mNGT was taking place. And so I read about it more and tried to adopt this technique. Unfortunately, I was not given enough time to truly use it effectively. Any advice on how to use mNGT in a timely manner? Well, I would say it takes some pre-planning. It's not a timely process anytime we start collecting qualitative data. So it's not efficient. I mean, I think it's more efficient than focus groups, but qualitative data is messy. So prepare for some rolling your sleeves up and putting your hands in the muck when you do qualitative work. But the main thing is to decide 2 or 3 questions. And I don't think you need more than that, just from my experience. I don't know that the literature would go along with me, but I think 2 or 3, just like a research question, make sure that it's not a double-barreled, like a survey questionnaire thing. Make sure you don't have that. Make sure you ask people, what do you think are the main reasons for this? Or, in the way I've used it in strategic planning, it's very simple. Everybody list all your strengths and weaknesses, and then what you think we have as opportunities and threats. And then when we get that's pre-work. They send those to me, I compile it, and then we have those sticky notes. And so in the strategic planning process in person, what I do, I think Ashley say something about flip charts earlier. I use flip charts and I write those questions. And then when we put all the answers together, I give everybody colored dots. And we rank, if everybody thinks that's most important, they just walk around the room putting green dots on what they think is the most important. And then they walk around the room putting yellow dots on what they think should be next, and just keep going like that. And then count the dots. And that's what the outcomes of this is. Everything's ranked. And we achieve consensus based on the rankings. And we just keep going through that, as Cindy mentioned earlier, round robin. So when I do these in person, it takes about 3, sometimes 3.5 hours. So it's a half a day kind of thing. I usually try to have breaks, right? And have some snacks, but it's a half a day process. So plan on that. Either of my colleagues want to add something?
I have done this with my staff before in student affairs, and we meet bi-weekly for about 1.5 hours. As a full staff, I broke it into chunks with them. And so if you already have a designated time and you want to maybe, try and break it into chunks, that is an option too. If you don't have the full half day, I just did 1 step at a time with them, and it gave them a little bit of extra time to reflect. And so that part was really engaging once we got to the conversation and ranking part.
And I haven't had the opportunity to use them outside of this project, but from what I could tell, right, from what I experienced, it is a lot of kind of like teaching. You have to really prepare before you start the process.
I love that, Cindy. Yeah, you need a lesson plan to do this. That's true. I should have said that, but you're right. It takes a lesson plan to do it without hiccups. And still, there's going to be some.
Thank you. Mhm.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, there was a Megan's comments about the white paper, how their group used the results to improve sales support for the members.
Right, and I was going to say something very similar to Megan's comment. I hope you recognize that we tried to keep this shorter than the traditional one. We tried to stop within 30 minutes because that was some of the feedback. We don't want 45-minute structured conversations every time. And so we did try to condense this one. So, and I'm happy, I'm sure my colleagues are too, email us, ask us questions, be happy to walk you through something, and I'm happy to provide free Zoom sessions to talk to anybody who wants to do this. So that's, I'm not offering to facilitate your NGTs. I don't have time for that. I'm sorry if I'm not clear, but I'm happy to meet with a person, at a time on Zoom and say, yeah, this is the way we did it. I appreciate this opportunity. It's been great to talk about it.
Great. If we don't have any more questions, I'd like to wrap up today's conversation. Vince?
Julie raised her hand. I saw a hand pop up.
I just I have a quick question for you. So this references document that you put together is fabulous. I'm wondering if, as somebody new to this who wants to dip their toe into the water, where's best to start? Is there a particular reference that you would say go to first to begin to learn?
Yeah, I would, that's a great question, Julie. Thank you. I would go to the Gresham dissertation. And if you work at a university and have library access, that article that's based on the Gresham dissertation is also a good one. I know not every library now, because of a lot of budget cuts, has access to that journal anymore, but that dissertation is available on ProQuest. And I think most universities have access to ProQuest. That was probably the most classic, best study I've seen. And he really goes through the history of everything, of how this thing came about, what are the weaknesses and strengths. And from there, I would go to the one that compares the focus group, the Delphi. I think it was consensus building. And then just, if you have like a reference tool or something, and then you just start finding the references that are applicable to what you see. I'm seeing that more and more of these pop up in the last 2 years than I ever imagined would happen.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, let me thank you again to today's guest speakers, Dr. Vince Nix, Dr. Ashley Farmer-Henson, and Dr. Cindy Fleming, and to the SAAL Professional Learning and Development Committee. Recording of today's session will be shared with you through emails and will also be available on the SAAL's website. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great day.